And thank you for everyone here at the school. It's a great honor and a real pleasure to be here today at Portsmouth Abbey to deliver the second Dom Luke Childs lecture of your school year. I first learned of Portsmouth Abbey School from one of your remarkable alumni, Peter Ferry, class of 1975, and a member of Portsmouth's Board of Regents. I'm not going to embarrass Lily by singling her out for special praise today as well, but his daughter in the third form. But Peter and I met in 1977 when we were both fellow students studying classics at the University of Pennsylvania. And you can hardly ask for a more prominent and more persuasive example of the benefits of a Portsmouth education, and indeed of rigorous training in classics, than Peter Ferry. He's put a stamp on the global financial world. Another Portsmouth alumnus who's had an enormous influence on me is Professor Michael C.J. Putnam. He's class of 1950. And for decades, Professor Putnam was synonymous with the teaching of classics at Brown University. And he also has played an enormously important continuing role at the American Academy in Rome. With architect Michael Graves, he's one of just 2 life trustees of that institution. Now, it's through the American Academy in Rome, where I spent a year in the 1980s, and indeed the last 3 years up to the past summer, that I came to know and admire Michael Putnam. And indeed, it's through the American Academy that I had my first semi-immersion in the Portsmouth Abbey of today. In June, I met Mr. Peter O'Connor, his wife Michelle, their daughter Kiara, brother Gregory, and the 35 genuinely impressive students who traveled to the Eternal City on the Portsmouth Rome Humanities program. And bringing 10% of the entire school to Rome, I found that absolutely amazing. And taking the students also outside the city to one of the most spiritualized and evocative sites anywhere in Europe, maybe the world, Subiaco, the first monastery of St. Benedict. I myself brought groups there several times, and my difficulty on each occasion is I didn't want to leave. Of course, in my 3 years as professor in charge at the American Academy, I had the opportunity to show many visiting groups around the 11-acre campus on the Janiculum Hill, and several each and every week, in fact. But for me, the 2 best and most memorable visits were both dated to my last full month at the American Academy, June of 2012. The Portsmouth group was remarkable for its energy, its inquisitiveness, its fashion flair, and its 100% participation rate in descending into the Roman-era aqueduct that runs underneath the American Academy in Rome. Now, the average age in the other group was a bit younger by a few years. It was the choir of Westminster Abbey. It was the choir's first ever tour of Italy, and at the Academy we treated them to dinner on their first night in the country. And later that week, they would perform together with the choir of the Sistine Chapel, then at St. Peter's Basilica as Pope Benedict celebrated Mass, and finally at the Benedictine Abbey of Monte Cassino. Now, as you may know, Westminster Abbey was originally a Benedictine foundation and remained so for more than 500 years. So my 2 most memorable and stimulating Roman experiences were with Benedictine and ex-Benedictine products. And was it a coincidence? You decide. Now, as for Portsmouth, it was some months ago that I received the very welcome invitation to deliver the Dom Luke Childs lecture. But it only took a few minutes, as I remember it, to decide on the topic of ravens, and was prompted, of course, by her school team name and mascot. Now, it's a nice coincidence that the Baltimore Ravens made it to yesterday's Super Bowl and won by 3 points, basically confounding all expectations. Now, the story how the Baltimore Ravens got their name, I find to be an interesting one. In 1984, the old Baltimore Colts moved to Indianapolis, and that broke my father's heart. I remember that. He claimed it was done under cover of night, no less. He was outraged. Now, it took almost a dozen years for the city to get back a professional football franchise. It was only in 1995 that the management of the Cleveland Browns announced that it would be moving that team to Baltimore. However, a new name and new colors were needed. Baltimore's leading newspaper, the Baltimore Sun, conducted a poll in which fully 2/3 of the 33,000 respondents chose the Ravens, and the runners-up, thank heavens, basically, the Baltimore Marauders, the Baltimore Americans, and so on and so forth. Why the Ravens? Well, in this instance, it was local pride in prose author, poet, and literary critic Edgar Allan Poe. A central fact about Edgar Allan Poe was that he was the first well-known American author to try to earn a living solely through writing. Poe was a Bostonian by birth, but after a famously disastrous academic career at University of Virginia, and even worse at West Point, He bounced around any number of cities, including Baltimore, trying to make a living. But he never met the financial success that he craved and that he needed. And Edgar Allan Poe died at age 40, just 4 years after publishing The Raven, now one of the most famous poems in the English language. He had sold it at the time for $15, about $350 in today's money. Of all those cities where Edgar Allan Poe lived, it's Baltimore that has a genuinely special claim. It was in Baltimore that in 1835 he married Virginia Clem, his 13-year-old cousin. And it was in Baltimore that he died in 1849. The earliest surviving home in which Poe lived is in Baltimore, and is today preserved as the Edgar Allan Poe House and Museum. There's many puzzles about Poe's life and work, including the cause of his death. I mean, modern guesses range from rabies to suicide. And how long it took him to compose The Raven. Again, there's hypotheses that range from 10 years to 1 day. And then there's the haunting poem itself, and everyone should know it, at least in outline, but give me the first 4 lines. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. This was not an early reference to hip hop. This was, as you know, that someone rapping was a raven, and a talking one at that. The bird enters the room and perches on a bust of Pallas Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom. Now, the persona in the poem, whom Poe later identified as a young scholar, has lost the love of his life named Lenore. And the young man happens to enter into dialogue with the raven, whom he takes as a visitor from Night's Plutonian shore, that is the realms of the dead. However, the only word the bird speaks in reply to an increasingly frantic series of questions about the fate of Lenore is nevermore. And in the course of this short poem, it only takes about 8 minutes to read aloud, the raven's monotonous and portentous response eventually drives the young man toward, not actually into, madness. Now, the vivid imagery of the poem positively begged for illustration. And within just a year or two of its composition, a young Gabriel Dante Rossetti, painter, poet, illustrator, founder of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, he provided. He was just 20 years old or so at the time, and many more were to follow. Here's Thomas Nast, later known as the father of American caricature. In 1862, at that time he was also in his early 20s. But the real prize has to go to the 26 steel engravings that were executed by the French artist Paul Gustave Doré and published posthumously in an oversized edition of Poe's Raven in 1884. And these illustrations became so famous that they provided an almost inescapable influence on all subsequent depictions or evocations of the poem. There's the raven on the bust of Athena, and basically the descent into madness. Now, about that same time, no less an artist than Manet tried his hand at illustrating scenes from the poem. But the Raven also gave ample scope for parody in both verse and illustration. And then, however, though, in a very real sense, it was motion pictures that opened up a new chapter in the reception of Edgar Allan's poem. The 1935 movie The Raven, suggested by, let me get my laser pointer out for this, basically suggested by Edgar Allan Poe's immortal classic. The emphasis is very much on suggested. Well, it made its way to the screen. Well, forget Lester Matthews and Irene Ware. The film is unforgettable for its appearance by horror king Bela Lugosi as I'm quoting here, a brilliant surgeon obsessed with Poe, who saves the life of a beautiful dancer and goes mad when he can't have her. And none other than the archduke Boris Karloff appears as the doctor's monstrous henchman. And basically, here's Lugosi. And basically, Lugosi's most memorable line was, "Poe, you are avenged!" Well, it was the film's striking visuals that more than anything helped cement the creepy reputation of the Raven with modern audiences. Boris Karloff reappeared in 1963 in A Raven that co-starred Vincent Price, shown here, and Peter Lorre. But this film was even more loosely based on the Edgar Allan Poe poem. There's a magician who's been turned into a raven, Peter Lorre, by an evil wizard, Boris Karloff, who turns for help to a former sorcerer, Vincent Price, who has lost a wife named Lenore, and the similarities stop there. The genre is probably horror comedy. I mean, it verges into Poe parody. Now, it's a pity that Edgar Allan Poe, in his lifetime, caught just a mere glimpse of the acclaim and fame that would greet him after his death. Today, you can basically talk about a Poe industry with basically, well, this is a comic book response to the 1963 film, but now, and here is a referential commemorative issue celebrating the 100th anniversary of the death of Edgar Allan Poe, 1849, 1949. But now, basically, lunchboxes, bobbleheads, and the true measure of arrival in the popular cultural mainstream. Action figures, complete with Raven. He's holding an SD disc there, by the way. Well, so much for the Ravens of Baltimore. I find it interesting for today's occasion, and this really will be 35 minutes from start to finish, that of all the school and college sports teams in North America, the name the Ravens is exquisitely rare. At the university level, I can just find three. First, basically here is the first and foremost, of course, the Portsmouth Abbey Ravens, which have started us off today. But basically, the Carleton Ravens, basically the largest institution in terms of students, Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario. The men's Ravens dominate Canadian college basketball. They won the national championship in Canada 8 times in the last 10 years. And their football team, which was dropped in the late 90s, will be making a reappearance in 2013. Why the Ravens? As it turns out, no one knows, not even the folks at the university's archive. It seems that the student newspaper started informally calling the Carleton football team the Ravens in 1948 because they had borrowed black uniforms. And it caught on, and that was that. However, the university has thoroughly embraced the moniker. It features 2 mega ravens that flank a phoenix, a smaller phoenix, on its official shield. Next, Anderson University is a private Christian liberal arts university in Anderson, Indiana. Until 1937, they were known as the Tigers. School officials, for reasons I can't determine, and I really tried, decided a change of name was needed, and they held a contest. The Ravens won out. Why? Here's from the university's website. 1, a raven, being black, agreed with the school's colors of black and orange, because they were the Tigers. 2, the raven has biblical history, as Elijah was apparently fed by ravens. More on that in a moment. And 3, the raven is considered aggressive, like what the university wanted its sports teams to be. I'm just quoting here. Third and last, Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. It was founded in 1971 by the merger of St. Benedict's College for Men and Mount St. Scholastica College for Women. It too has an abbey and monastery on the campus. It's one of the attributes that really does make Portsmouth so distinctive. And Benedictine College chose the raven as its mascot for precisely the same reason as Portsmouth. The second book of the dialogues of St. Gregory the Great features a story in which a raven saves St. Benedict from eating poisoned bread. At mealtimes, says St. Gregory's near contemporary account, a raven used to come out of the nearby wood and take bread from Benedict's hand. In other words, Benedict fed a raven with some of his meager ration. This time, when it came as usual, the man of God threw down in front of the raven the bread that a rival jealous priest had handed him. It had been poisoned, saying, "In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, take this bread and drop it somewhere where no one can find it." And after hesitating a long time, and the delay is quite emphasized in the account, the raven took the bread in its beak, picked it up, and they flew away. 3 hours later, the raven came back after having thrown the bread away and received its usual ration from the hands of the man of God. This special connection of St. Benedict to the raven has found its way into much of his subsequent iconography. But the story, of the bird picking up the bread in its beak is hardly self-explanatory. Indeed, it positively begs for more background. And also, I'm going to attempt to explain it to myself. The title for my attempt I borrowed from 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird by Wallace Stevens' first book of poetry. Stevens' poem was published in 1917 and consists of 13 short, separate segments, all of which mention blackbirds in some way. And I'm going to do the same here this morning, merely sketching the attributes I find most significant about the treatment of ravens in the Western tradition, particularly those stemming from Greek, Roman, and Jewish culture. One could do the same for the Old Norse, or especially Native American cultures. And of course, there's no end to what can be said about ravens in reference to the exact sciences, ranging from ornithology proper to astronomy. But here this morning, I'll simply focus on the aspects of this enigmatic bird that have lodged themselves most firmly in the popular and educated imagination. First, and here's the enigma, you can see the enigma with Russian peasants gathering around a solitary raven. First, sound. The scientific name of the common raven is Corvus corax. And corax is the word for raven in Greek, and corvus is the word in Latin. And both came from the same Indo-European root, cher, or car, which is imitative of harsh sounds. And from this root, it seems, ultimately derives Old English raven, which gives rise to our raven. It's closely related to the familiar English word croak and emulsion. Even in the Roman view, the raven took its name from the resonant sound of its voice. One notion was that what the bird really was saying was crass, crass, which means tomorrow, tomorrow in Latin. Edgar Allan Poe's bird, of course, said the opposite, nevermore. For his talking raven, we know the most probable direct source. It was a historical novel that Charles Dickens wrote named Barnaby Rudge and started serialization in 1841. Today it hardly commends itself to readers. Now, one of the characters in the novel is a tame talking raven named Grip, the protagonist Penn. Poe certainly knew Dickens' work, for he reviewed the first 3 installments in the Saturday Evening Post. Indeed, he praised the introduction of the, I'm quoting here, human-looking raven, whose croakings are to be frequently, appropriately, and prophetically heard in the course of the narrative. Poe viewed this as a mark of Dickens' instinctive genius. As it so happens, Dickens had an actual pet raven named Grip, who had died that very year. The author had the bird mounted, or taxidermized, as Chuck Testa would say, and through a circuitous route, eventually it landed in Philadelphia, where it can be seen today on display in the Free Library. Color. About color, not much needs to be said. The bird's plumage is black, indeed, intensely black. In the Greek world, to see a white raven was a proverbial saying meant to witness the impossible. Now, how black? The Roman polymath Pliny the Elder, who died getting too close to Mount Vesuvius in AD 79, he recommended the following: using a single pulverized egg of the raven to dye one's hair a glossy black. But one ran real risks in using this potent therapy. Care must be taken, says Pliny, to keep some oil in the mouth till the application is quite dry, or else the teeth will turn black as well. In other words, it's one egg isn't pulverized, it's enough to come through your skull and to dye your teeth. The operation must be performed also in the shade, and the liniment must not be washed off before the end of 3 days. That's a long time to have oil in the mouth. Now, according to a familiar Greek and Roman myth, originally, the raven was not black. It was the god Apollo, seen here, who turned the bird that color. And there's the raven. In a horrible series of events that, to judge from this coin, seems to have appealed to the Emperor Domitian's totalitarian regime. As the story goes, the god Apollo had a lover named Coronis, and the name is cognated with corax, raven, with whom he was to have his child, none other than Asclepius, the healing god. But Coronis fell in love with another, a mortal, and a white raven, which Apollo had left as a minder over his girlfriend, informed him of the affair. However, Apollo blamed the bird for not pecking out the man's eyes as soon as he approached Coronis. In a rage, he scorched his feathers, which is meant to explain why all subsequent ravens are black, and then Apollo then had Coronis killed. The mention of pecking with a beak is significant, because the raven's prominent beak was for the ancients an attribute that prompted both fear and curiosity. There was even a long-standing popular belief that the beak was its organ of reproduction. We've seen Poe speak of the human-looking raven, and through the centuries it was the bird's beak more than anything that suggested the comparison. Here's a 17th century treatise on physiognomy. It's the pseudoscience that claimed the ability to divine one's character or even fate from physical features. And this shows this quite nicely on the left. The comparison of human features with those of animals and inferring a human character from the corresponding animal's behavior. This was an important part of the stock in trade of physiognomists. And the manual depicted here exhibits the Ravenesque man on the left as an example of the grasping, thieving type, just like the rapacious raven. And there's much more to be said regarding the theme of the raven's human-like appearance, but I'm going to turn from external attributes to an internal attribute on which almost all authorities, modern and ancient, are agreed. Intelligence. Peter Stackpole was one of Life magazine's first staff photographers. In 1939, he documented the results of an animal trainer's months of work with a pair of wild ravens. The ability to hang upside down from the trainer's hand was the least of it. A raven typing his own name on the typewriter. I'm just reading the photo captions from Life. One raven looking up a telephone number while the other raven dials it. A trained raven smoking a pipe. Though, of course, today we would not take this as a sign of intelligence. Quite the opposite. The larger point here, and there is a larger point here, that this substantiates what has been suspected since antiquity, that the raven ranks near the top of all birds in the IQ category, and was capable of actual tasks, even tools. Indeed, we find already in Genesis that the first animal that Noah released from his ark was the raven. So it came to pass at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made. Then he sent out a raven, which kept going to and fro until the waters had dried up from the earth. He also sent out for himself a dove to see if the waters had receded from the face of the ground. The raven and the dove later frequently trotted out as polar opposites in the bird kingdom. Doves in antiquity were a symbol of simplicity, harmlessness. They were renowned for their conjugal affection, chastity, care of their young, and ravens not. What made the blackbird distinctive in the summary of one mid-19th century authority is A, the raven is solitary, B, it preys upon carrion, dead bodies, and C, utters a deep, uninterrupted croak. Now, the solitary attribute is significant. Although ravens can commonly be seen in mated pairs, it's revealing that there's no good collected noun in English for a group of ravens other than the generic flock. Expressions such as an unkindness of ravens and a conspiracy of ravens have now quite fallen out of use. And one might add that common ravens don't just live, but they actually thrive in seemingly impossible climates. They range from the expected temperate habitats in North America, Eurasia, to islands in the Pacific Ocean, to the deserts in North Africa, to the Arctic regions as depicted here. Ravens even have been spotted within 9,000 feet of the peak of Mount Everest, and at that altitude, the level of oxygen is just 75% what it is at sea level. Though obviously a hardy bird, in antiquity the raven had the reputation of lacking natural love for its young and not caring to feed them. Other birds, it was alleged, had to step in and adopt them. But modern observation has shown this to be nonsense. Diet. Feeding on carrion is another matter. It's proverbial in literature from the Greek tragedian Aeschylus on downward, and it's lavishly documented in actual fact. Nothing was thought to be too strong for a raven's stomach. After killing a chameleon, reports our friend, the elder Pliny, the raven uses a leaf of laurel as an antidote to the reptile's venom. Now, an odd but persistent perception was that ravens had a particular penchant for attacking and eating the eyes of sheep, of humans, what have you. And famously, the Latin poet Catullus says in one poem, he predicts that the Roman people, if they ever put a certain knave to death, the raven's black throat would tear out and swallow down his eyes. This belief readily survived in antiquity. Take, for instance, the ancestral arms depicted here of the Prince of Schwarzenberg. It's a territory that's now in the Czech Republic. After this man's family, in 1594, conquered an Ottoman fortress in Hungary called Raab, R-A-A-B, it created an emblem with the head of a Turk, with his eyes being poked out by a raven. And basically, here is the raven, and here is the head. And basically, the German word for raven is Rabe, R-A-B-E, which will have suggested the grisly image. But the proclivity of the raven to carrion would have had a brighter side as well. Tradition has it that the body of the 7th century English king in St. Oswald was hacked to pieces on the battlefield where he fell, and his enemies stuck his head and arms on poles in triumph. But Oswald's pet raven swooped down to take one arm in its beak, which he dropped down before a tree, and when the arm fell to the ground, a holy well sprang up, and this is counted as one of the saint's many miracles. It was the human-like attributes of the raven that practically guaranteed its frequent appearance in the body of moralizing fables collected in antiquity under the name of Aesop. The most famous tale is that of the fox and the raven. It's a story that's already well known to the Romans, to the Roman poet Horace. The raven seized a piece of cheese, goes the fable, and he carried his spoils to his perch high in a tree. Picture it here, that's a cheese. A fox came up, walked in circles around the raven, and planned a trick. "What's this?" cries the fox. "Oh, raven, the elegant proportions of your body are remarkable, and you have a complexion that's worthy of the king of the birds. If only you had a voice to match, then you would be the first amongst the fowl." The fox said these things to trick the raven, and the raven fell for it. So he let out a great squawk and dropped his cheese. By thus showing off his voice, the raven let go of his spoils. The fox then grabbed the cheese and said, "Ah, raven, you have a voice, but you have no brains to go with it." The moral, and there's always a moral to Aesop's fables. If you follow your enemy's advice, you will get hurt. Here's a later depiction of the fox and the raven. These fables in general make much of the raven's squawking but still distinct voice. There's one story in Aesop that's predicated on a raven saying, "Ave, ave," which in Latin means hello, hello, feeding on carrying its thievery, its vanity, but also its hardiness. And one thing that emerges very clearly in Aesop is a strong belief in the raven's predictive powers, which makes it distinctive amongst birds. "The crow was jealous of the raven's power to reveal signs to mankind by means of omens," says one fable, since the raven was always being consulted to find out what was going to happen. So the jealous crow, seeking attention, sees some travelers, flies up to a tree, perches there, squawks loudly, and the men turn to the sound in alarm. But then one of them said, "Hey, let it go, it's just a crow. Squawking does not mean a thing." Moral: when someone tries to imitate his superiors, he will both fail in his attempt and become the butt of jokes. It would make for a very, very long story to trace the figure of the raven in the later fables of the Middle Ages. There, the individual stories take on great complexity, and so much so that they eventually become part of European high literature. I do think we can trace a bit of development, and these are all German woodcuts of the 15th century, of various raven-based stories. Where we get a bit of development, that means there we get a more collaborative bird, often conspiring with other animals to outwit authority figures, human hunters, and the like. And here's the raven who delivers food to an exhausted pig. I have not found a literary treatment of this. The highest functioning, highest status ravens in antiquity belong to Norse mythology. In Scandinavian tradition, the gods Odin had a pair of ravens, Hugin, which means thought in Old Norse, and Munin, which means memory. And he sent these ravens all over the world to gather information. In a sense, the raven was for the Vikings an important symbol of far-flung imperialism. I think actually the next image is even more clear. This is a raven cropping up on the coinage of Anlef Guthfrithson. He's the Viking king of the York in England in the mid-10th century. It also crops up on Viking banner standards, sails, and the like. And the pre-existing Celt, Cornish, Welsh inhabitants of the British Isles had some divine ravens in their own central myths. I can imagine they could understand and appreciate the symbolism. Flash forward 500 years later to Central Europe. To solve a succession crisis in the mid-15th century, the Hungarians looked toward a junior member of their ruling dynasty, then married to a Czech princess. But how do you summon, in a jiffy, this young man to the now vacant throne? Well, his mother sent for him, so the legend goes, by placing a ring in the beak of a raven. That's a ring. That's the raven. The raven then allegedly flew non-stop from Transylvania to Prague, and so the boy king of the ravens was crowned, taking the name Corvinus from the raven. The family, which was patently promoting the story, made the raven with ring motif a prominent part of its family crest. And the good news is that Matthias Corvinus, depicted here, then ruled effectively for 42 years. He was really the person who brought the Renaissance to his native Hungary. And to this day, Hungarians considered him the greatest and most enlightened ruler. And ubiquitous Budapester depictions of the raven with ring in its beak. And the long-distance flying and the bird's ability to understand instructions is essential to the story. And for his part, young Matthias Corvinus needed all the help he could get to secure the Hungarian throne. And by offering himself as a raven king, it was an ingenious device to exude instant charisma. Much less impressive is the, and then basically today he's commemorated at the University of Budapest. Much less impressive is the story of the symbol of the coinage of Freiburg in Germany. In the mid-14th century, its mint started issuing coins with an eagle's head that was so poorly executed that it looked for all the world like a raven. And the name Rappen stuck for the coin. Raven is Rabe in German, and it was then pronounced Rappe. Soon Freiburg and some other cities formed a Rappenbund, a raven mint union, and 1/100 of a franc in Switzerland is still called a Rappen. And in its origins, it really is just a degenerate eagle. But here is an early 20th century attempt to restore the raven to its regal splendor. It's a medallion from the short-lived kingdom of Montenegro, north of Albania. During World War I, Montenegro was allied with the Allied powers, but Austria-Hungary occupied it from January 1916 to the end of the war. Here's a defiant King Nicholas, who signals with the dove on the obverse that he's a man of peace, but on the reverse, the raven on the wing here is carrying not just a ring, he's carrying a crown, and it symbolizes his government's tactical retreat to exile in France, but alas, he never would return to rule. In at least one instance, very much from the contemporary world, ravens can function as a symbol of royal power just by existing and behaving themselves. According to legend, if the ravens of the Tower of London are lost or fly away, the crown will fall and Britain with it. And it's widely believed that there's been at least 6 ravens in residence at the Tower for centuries, indeed since the 13th century. And that in 1675, King Charles II protected them by royal decree, fearing the grim prophecy of his kingdom's fall. And today there's this elaborate mechanism to keep the tower's population of ravens suitably domesticated and stable. The birds are deemed as military personnel. They have their own barracks, depicted here, and they have a human raven master. They're enlisted, and they can be dismissed. In 1986, this happened to a raven named George. Basically, he was dismissed for conduct unsatisfactory after demolishing television antennae. However, the trouble is, the ravens, there's the raven master. Basically, the tower's own archivist claims to have found no reference to these ravens before an 1895 article in the Journal of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Apparently, there was 2 ravens, and one is singled out by its name, and they were tormenting the tower's pet cat. Now, sad to report, the tower ravens are probably a product of Victorian pseudo-medievalism, with an invented pedigree and an accompanying legend. And that the fact that the raven's favorite haunt seems to be the Tower Green, the former site of royal beheadings, facilitated modern-era myth-making. But the facts didn't get in the way of the 1962 MGM horror film classic, The Tower of London. It's sort of based on Shakespeare's Richard III, and it inevitably stars Vincent Price, this time as a demented 15th century despot, haunted by his victims' ghosts and creepy ravens galore. For the raven has been since the classical era the bird of ill omen par excellence. The observed habit of ravens setting down in places of execution, even following armies, and the expectation of feeding upon corpses readily made it an accepted signifier of death. There's a banal and ubiquitous curse in all periods of ancient Greek es korokos, go to the ravens, i.e. to your demise. German Rabenstein, or obsolete English Ravenstone, meant a place of execution. Irish English has the expression, to be in the raven's book, which means a list of the dead, or those fated to die soon. An elaborate illustration of the bird of ill omen is hardly required. This is an early 15th century depiction of the so-called melancholic personality in the act of committing suicide while staring at a raven. A raven announcing imminent death. Indeed, there's an old secondary meaning of raven as a person with bad news to report. And there's numerous images where the raven accompanies the personification of death itself. A little hard to discern here, but basically, for example, in this 16th century woodcut, or engraving. I'm intrigued in particular by this image here. It's a little hard to see, even if you're in the front row. But basically, it's an anti-Catholic medal of 1685 that commemorates the persecution of French Protestants. The medalist clearly was trying to squeeze into the small medium a maximum number of grisly symbols. I mean, we have Pope Innocent XI here, basically standing on top of a 7-headed monster that are devouring a man and woman, and he is flanked by a Vatican soldier here, I remember the Swiss Guard, and a Jesuit on the right. On the reverse, gallows, basically someone wielding a sword, cutting people down, dead, crumbling brick building, dogs gnawing at cadavers, and there's your raven. I mean, basically, it's case closed. Here's, at least for me, this is George Stubbs, the 18th century British artist who's known as the finest painter of horses who has ever lived. It is an illustration of a fable, The Farmer's Wife and the Raven. Her old horse is startled by the squawking of a raven, seen at upper right, which causes it to stumble and fall. There's the raven. And the eggs which she was aiming to take to market fall out of the basket and are broken. And the painting, as it turns out, has a long inscription. Says the wife, "That raven on yon left-hand oak, curse on his ill-betiding croak, bodes me no good." And then she curses the ravens in no uncertain terms. In fact, I can't even repeat the curse in this audience. Raven answers, "Dame," quoth the raven. Does that sound familiar? Quoth the raven. "Dame," quoth the raven, "spare your oaths." And then he points out that the horse she chose was too old for the task, happened also to be blind, and she has her own greed of making basically to blame. Here's also a rare woodcut from the master of German Romanticism, Caspar David Friedrich. "Ill omen galore, 2 ravens, fallen tree, craggy peaks, menacing snake on the ground," with this woman staring at the viewer, standing midpoint between the viewer and a chasm. Hand in hand, and basically even M.C. Escher, basically the famous engraver, gets into the act. And that's you can see the dark raven there. Hand in hand with foreboding ill went the raven's supposed gift of prophecy. And we saw a glimpse of that in the ancient fable tradition. In fact, it was widely perceived in the Greek and Roman worlds that a raven had particular skill as a weather prophet, especially as a predictor of rain and storms. We find this in Virgil's Georgics. But it went well beyond that. I mean, ravens supposedly predicted the Athenian disaster in Sicily in the late 5th century BC, conducted Alexander the Great to an oasis in Egypt, but then subsequently gave warning of his death. And the Romans made much of the divining the will of the gods, Jupiter, from observing the flight and behavior of birds. Here's our raven here. The system of divining the will of Jupiter was called the auspices, taking the auspices. It literally meant bird watching. The Romans engaged in this practice before practically every important public and private act, from the primeval era, so it was thought, and for many centuries to follow. And ravens had a special place in this belief system, for it was thought that ravens alone of birds seemed to have understood what their appearance or actions were actually signifying. All other fowl were non-comprehending agents of the divine. And basically from the Emperor Vitellius in the 1st century AD, our raven on reverse. We're getting near to the end, the symbol of unexpected help. During one famous crisis, the gods were supposed to have used a raven to offer somewhat more tangible help to the Romans, and the historian Livy tells the tale. It's the year of 349 BC. A certain Marcus Valerius was about to embark in single combat with the Gaul. It was a match arranged to decide the battle for both forces. A raven appeared unexpectedly and landed on the Roman's helmet. Amazed, he accepted as a divine omen, prayed for help for whatever God had sent it. Could have been Jupiter, could have been Apollo. No sense taking any chances. But it gets better. The raven then attacks and claws the face of the Gaul, which allows Marcus Valerius to kill him. The raven then flies away to the east, which is the lucky direction, and in the ensuing battle over the armor of the fallen Gauls, well, there's a total rout of his countrymen. Here's Marcus Valerius, and basically there's our raven landing on his helmet in the 16th century depiction. And Marcus Valerius' third name from then on was Corvus, Marcus Valerius Corvus, and a distinguished career, exceptionally distinguished career that lasts 4 decades follows. The story of the raven and the gull forms a well-known chapter in Rome's patriotic history, and the 16th century text gets the point of the story exactly right. Inspiratum auxilium, or unexpected help. This dovetails, so to speak, into my final point, symbol of divine providence. Both the Jewish and Christian traditions have parallel instances, but where faith precedes the intercession. From the Jewish Bible, Elijah, the well-known instance. I can hardly do justice here to the story or the many commentaries. In some, in 1 Kings, Elijah announces a great drought upon the Israelites who are practicing idolatry. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. So Elijah did what the Lord had told him. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook, which eventually dries up. It's been often observed that God's choice is specifically a raven as opposed to an angel, aimed not just at sustaining Elijah, but also teaching mercy to the prophet. Here was the meanest of creatures, with a reputation of not even looking after its own, coming to Elijah's aid twice a day. But the episode long has stood as a symbol of divine providence for the righteous. Poe even references it in The Raven as such, and you can see here basically a thank offering for Spanish inhabitants of the Netherlands being spared in a plague, with the symbol of Elijah receiving food from the raven on the obverse. One final raven story. The holy man St. Paul of Thebes in Egypt is generally regarded as the first hermit. He escaped the persecutions of the year AD 250 by fleeing to the desert, and there Paul remained for the next 90 years. And here's the story as Jerome tells it. When Paul, this is a little hard to discern, basically the 15th century, this will actually do better. Paul's now 113 years old. When the Lord wanted to reveal the holiness of St. Paul and his righteousness, says Jerome, he sent his angel to St. Anthony the Great, who thought that he was the first to dwell in the wilderness. The angel told St. Anthony, there is a man who lives in the inner wilderness. The world is not worthy of his footsteps. By his prayers, the Lord brings rain and dew to fall on the earth and brings the flood of the Nile in its due season. Now when St. Anthony heard this, he rose right away and went to the inner wilderness, a distance of 1 day's walk. God guided him to the cave of St. Paul. He entered, they bowed to each other, and they sat down talking about the greatness of the Lord. In the evening, a raven came bringing a whole loaf of bread. St. Paul said to St. Anthony, now I know that you are one of the children of God. Why? Because for 70 years, the Lord's been sending to me every day half a loaf of bread. But today, the Lord is sending your food also. Alas, when Antony next visited him, Paul was dead. This has caught the interest of attention of many, many authors. I mean, basically, and here is the raven delivering the whole loaf, the two hermits. Also, basically, from an Antony perspective as opposed to a Paul perspective. There's St. Anthony the abbot and sitting with St. Paul, receiving the bread. Here's St. Paul basically in the leading up to that famous incident, 17th century depiction. And also the raven here is basically very much in the school of Caravaggio here. The raven is so black that you can hardly see. And that's on purpose, basically, delivering the food. So where does all this leave us? I must say in all humility before this audience, the sources of these very complex and in places contradictory traditions, I really don't know. But here's an amateur's reaction, and it's really my own personal response. What strikes me after the survey is that the story of St. Benedict and his raven seems quite unique. St. Benedict does not receive food from the raven, rather he feeds the raven. Indeed, he develops over time a relationship with this most unlikely of birds. Intelligent, yes, and capable of some speech, but one whose historical connotations range from unpleasant to unsettling to outright terrifying. When needed, Saint Benedict draws on that relationship and leverages it to diffuse with exquisite tact an explosive situation in his tight community. He sensed a jealous priest was trying to poison him. It took some doing, but Benedict convinced the raven to dispose of what seemed to be a perfectly delectable loaf of bread and to fly 1.5 hours each way to do it. That type of training makes the gimmick of typing or smoking raven seem rather lame in comparison, I think you'll agree. The raven obeys, no one gets hurt, and the delicate fabric of the monastery's communal life remains intact. And not even the raven gets to learn the real background to what had transpired. Indeed, his regime continues as if nothing had happened. In a word, Saint Benedict offers, at least to me, an elegant and extremely humane lesson in social problem solving, even in an extreme situation. Put in today's terms, you may want to think twice before hitting reply all. The story of the raven bringing aid to Elijah, or Saints Paul and Anthony, or Marcus Valerius Corvus for that matter, strikes me as representing a somewhat different narrative from that of Saint Benedict, that of divine help from thin air. But from my point of view, I find that Portsmouth Abbey is a very prominent symbol of that deep-seated tradition right in the center of your own campus. For indeed, I count it as a modern miracle to have a wind turbine that can supply clean power for fully 40% of the school's electrical energy use. Though setting up and making operational this 240-foot structure from top to bottom required quite a bit more planning than Marcus Valerius Corvus devoted to that duel with the Gaul. This school is an example to all of us in so many ways. It's a privilege for me to visit, to speak with you today, and further, to speak with you, and as the day progresses, and I hope beyond. Thank you.